As you probably know, if you're in tech, Meta was the first big tech company to fully embrace open source AI. Llama leaked last year. Folks said that it wasn't leaked. It was released covertly or on the slide, DL, by the folks at Meta. But they just released Llama 3. And I talked to Sandeep about this a whole bunch last week. It just came out a few days ago, and it's already in the top 2 models on Hugging Face's leaderboard. You can take a look at Hugging Face's leaderboard. It's basically where it's the most trusted place, I think, where people benchmark these things. Developers are saying it's faster. It's less preachy, was an observation, than Chat GPT-4, despite being slightly lower quality. They also have some small models that are performing really well. They also announced, very interestingly, open sourcing the Quest operating system called Meta Horizons OS. The OS powers the mixed reality headsets, VR, all that kind of stuff, AR. But here's the big news. This one is amazing. Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp are integrating a search box or their AI assistant chat box into all their apps. Worth noting, Meta came out with their results just the other day, and we're taping this on Thursday, as you know, it comes out Friday. Their stock is down as much as 16% after reporting its Q1 earnings. They beat estimates, but Zuck is saying he's going to spend a bucket load of cash on infrastructure. Chamath, it's your alma mater. He worked side by side with Zuck, growing Facebook from 10, 20 million to 400 million MAUs. What do you think of his
800
strategy?
million when I left.
Okay. What are your thoughts on Gold Chain Zuck and his new strategy, the pivot away from VR to AR, AI, and going full all in, so to speak, on open source?
They're taking a play that we talked about, which makes a ton of sense, which is it's not a core market, but it's very important. The core money-making market for them is monetizing their family of apps. And so they're scorching the earth for these new markets so that the economics are not viable, which will, I think, allow a more robust ecosystem where they'll have more of a say. Because I think up until this point, you could have said that they and Google were sort of lagging behind OpenAI, but I don't think that's the case. And by the way, this is the strategy that we talked about 16 months ago that these big companies should take. I just think it's worth listening to what we said and then basically what Zuck said just right now.
Here we go. This is a black and white flashback. Chamath in a turtleneck. Go.
I think that Google will open source their models because the most important thing that Google can do is reinforce the value of search. And the best way to do that is to scorch the earth with these models, which is to make them widely available and as free as possible. That will cause Microsoft to have to catch up, and that will cause Facebook to have to really look in the mirror and decide whether they're going to cap the betting that they've made on AR, VR and reallocate very aggressively to AI. That should be what Facebook does. And the reason is, if Facebook and Google and Microsoft have roughly the same capability and the same model, there's an element of machine learning called reinforcement learning. And specifically, it's reinforcement learning from human feedback. Facebook has an enormous amount of reinforcement learning inside of Facebook. Every click, every comment, every like, every share, the huge companies will create the substrates. And I think they'll be forced to scorch the earth and give it away for free. Now you can see what Zuck said last week.
Look at this, a little victory lap here.
It's probably also pretty bad for one institution to have an AI that is way more powerful than everyone else's AI. And I kind of think that a world where AI is very widely deployed in a way where it's gotten hardened progressively over time, and is one where all the different systems will be in check in a way that seems like it is fundamentally more healthy to me than one where this is more concentrated.
That is, I think, the definition of scorched earth. So, and he's running a really perfect play so far. He's open sourced the headset OS. He's opening sourced these models. He stopped training, I think, for Llama 3.5, was it? And now he's moved directly to Llama 4 just to try to head off GPT-5 at the pass. Well, so what are we seeing? We're seeing the economic value getting disintegrated. There is no value in foundational models economically. So then the question is, who can build on top of them the fastest? And Jason, to your point, Llama was announced last Thursday. 14 hours later, Grok actually had that model deployed in the Grok cloud. so that 100,000 plus developers could start building on it. That's why that model is so popular. So it puts the closed models on their heels, because if you can't both train and deploy iteratively and quickly enough, these open source alternatives will win. And as a result, the economic potential that you have to monetize those models will not be there. And what that does is reinforce the existing economic moat that Facebook already has in monetizing their apps. Now, why the stock went down, I'd like to talk in contrast to Tesla a little bit later, because this has nothing to do with that, and it's more about squares versus sharps in the stock market.
Freeberg, your thoughts on Meta embracing, going all in on AI. You were at Google, your alma mater, and you watched them be proprietary and closed when it came to search and the search algorithm, but open source when they were behind. And that's, I guess, the phrase we use here in Silicon Valley. When you're behind, you use open source to catch up. And when you're ahead, you close everything down. Facebook famously shut down all access to their APIs. You can't get into the social graph. But they're going open here. Why? Because they're behind. Your thoughts on this from, say, a Google perspective, and then maybe how Google might react. And then just broadly, do you think open source wins the day, getting to AGI?
I would say the analogy for Google is Android, where Google open sourced the Android operating system because the handset manufacturers and some of the big software companies, so Nokia and Microsoft in particular, BlackBerry, had these closed proprietary operating systems. And then the telcos put their apps on and made money and basically had control over whether or not people could access Google and Google services through their phone. So the intention with open sourcing Android was to make sure that Google was not disadvantaged in their core business over time. I think that there's a similar analogy here, that by open sourcing these models, they limit competition because VCs are no longer going to plow $500 million into a foundational model development company. So you limit the commercial interest and the commercial value of foundational models. Now, the CapEx question is a really hard one to diagnose because we don't know how they're spending the money, where they're spending the money, what they're doing in there. I think that it's a really important sign that founder-led companies with these voting rights, have the ability to make these sorts of hard decisions that it might be very difficult for a management by committee group to make.
Got it.
Look at how Mark is making these decisions and Elon is making big, tough decisions that it would very likely be pushed back on if they didn't have the voting rights, if they didn't have the control over the company that they had.
It's a great point about founder authority. I think that's a really salient point. A shout out to Zuck. Would really be great to get him at the All In Summit. Sachs, we have some breaking news here. It turns out Llama 3, they just tested it in the benchmarks. It says here you can make the founding fathers any race you like. It's a really interesting feature. Any thoughts on Facebook's strategy here? You are a master strategist, David Sachs. Give us your master strategy here, 1700 chess rating, Sachs.
Well, we kind of glossed over what the real news was, which was that Meta released Llama 3, which they had spent billions of dollars creating in a completely open source way. And the testing on Llama 3 is that it's comparable to GPT-4. And I think this is what Chamath means by scorched earth, is that we now have a free model that's as good as GPT-4. Best in class, or at least tied for best in class. There are some slight differences, and we've been playing around with it. It is faster and cheaper than using ChatGPT-4, but the context window is smaller. I think it has only an 8,000 token context window. So that's something that the open source community is going to need to work on, is rolling out foundation models that have a bigger context window. Nonetheless, the point is that at least for now, until OpenAI comes out with GPT-5, which is supposed to happen soon, the open source community has kind of caught up with the top closed source model, which is OpenAI.
Will they blow past the closed source model, Sachs?
Well, I still think that OpenAI is ahead because the scuttlebutt about ChatGPT-5 is that it's amazing and it's a big improvement over GPT-4. And supposedly it's going to come out any day, week, or month. So if GPT-5 comes out and knocks our socks off in a few weeks, then we're going to see that, they're actually a cycle ahead of the open source community. But as of this moment, in terms of what's been publicly released, I think it's fair to say that open source is largely caught up with OpenAI. And this is why, bring up this tweet by Naveen Rao, who is a founder who created the company Mosaic ML, which is sold to Databricks for unicorn outcome. And he says, I don't think everyone has comprehended the massive disruption and distortion that's going to happen in the Gen AI market due to Llama 3. Moats will be destroyed and investments will go to zero. Just like everything in Gen AI, this will all happen fast. So, it's a similar reaction to what Chamath is saying, which is we have an open source model now that erases billions of dollars of private investment.
And by the way, you just said something really interesting before, which is, okay, there's a limitation, right? You mentioned the context window, which was a problem. I just found this thing today. They solved it. Now they're at 96K context.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So to your point, Sachs, this market is moving so fast because you cannot compete with open source. So all these closed models, which means OpenAI and a bunch of these other folks, especially the ones that are sitting inside of these smaller companies, right? Snowflake has a model. I think Databricks has a model. There's an important question that has to be asked around the economic viability of these models in a world where open source is not only better and better funded, but they're iterating faster and the feature set is catching up to your needs. So the minute that Sachs says he needs a longer context window, within a week, it's there. That's pretty intense.
Yeah, I think this is like one of the...
What do you think, Jaco?
Well, I've got a totally different take on this. Obviously, I agree with all you've said here in terms of the open source and the dramatic effect it's going to have on pricing. But there's something people are missing. If you go to meta.ai for a second, Nick, and you pull it up, what you'll see is they've dedicated the meta.ai URL to a search-like experience. And then they've put a search box at the top of Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook. And so they are going to put search engine, essentially, their modern search engine, which is starting from zero, in front of 3 billion people using Meta's collection of services. And so just like Apple and Firefox were able to intercept search traffic, I think, and let's make a prediction here, that Meta is going to get 10 points of the search market. Now, each point of the search market is worth, what is Google's worth? About 2 trillion. If you take out 500 billion for YouTube and their other services, you get 1.5 trillion, which means 10 points is worth 150 billion in market cap. Now, as you well know, Chamath, and you well know, David, these two ad networks, Meta started with psychographic data, the person, who they know. And then, of course, Google had the greatest advertising product ever, intent. You type in Volvo, you type in Tesla Santa Monica, used, you don't have to guess what the person is interested in at that moment. Well, for the first time, one of these ad networks has intent data and psychographic, and they're going to be able to put it together. And I think they take 10 points of search, but more importantly, they're going to have data on individuals that will be unrivaled in the advertising space. Now, Google tried to do this themselves. They did something called Google Plus. I don't know if you were there, Freeberg, during the Google Plus era. They spent billions of dollars on a social network. It failed. They shut it down because they wanted to get that. So looking at this, I think, man, there's so much going on open source, but now Google, and we haven't talked about Google's role in all of this, and Sundar being a hired gun, not having founder authority, to your point, Freeberg, I think they're going after Google's search business, as well as, taking away and commoditizing all of the open source. So we might be sitting here in 3 or 4 years watching Meta have, 10.
Nobody has to win in search. It's just that Google can't afford to lose anything.
Yeah.
Everybody takes a point here and a point there, and all of a sudden Google could be in the high 70s of search, and that would be economically disastrous for their stock.
Yeah. You're going to have to make cuts.
Why do you guys think the stock is down? Why is the stock down 16%? I have a theory as to why.
No, tell us your theory. Yeah. Go for it.
I think that there's a few times a quarter where you can really see the dispersion in the stock market between what I would call the smart money and everybody else. So, using betting language, the sharps and the squares. And I think Meta was an example of the sharps taking a line, which I think is very accurate. And Tesla was the other great example this quarter. And so if you look inside of Meta, and this Freeberg mentioned this earlier, I think Freeberg, what people really reacted negatively to was the total quantum of spending and the idea that it's misallocated, not to AI, but specifically to NVIDIA. And the reason is that, and we've mentioned this before, I've tried to talk a lot about this with Jonathan Ross from Grok, but AI is really two markets, training and inference. And inference is going to be 100 times bigger than training. And NVIDIA is really good at training and very miscast at inference. The problem is that right now we need to see a CapEx build cycle for inference. And there are so many cheap and effective solutions. Grok being one of them, but there are many others. And I think why the market reacted very negatively was it did not seem that Facebook understood that distinction. That they were way overspending and trying to allocate a bunch of GPU capacity towards inference that didn't make sense. And so I think what people were saying is, hold on a second. So far, your plays are perfect. It's everything we want you to do. We want you to scorch the earth. We want you to open source the headset. But we also want you to understand the difference between training and inference in a little bit more of a nuanced way. Build up the inference capacity, but spend a lot less money because you don't need to spend it on NVIDIA. And the reason is the sharps know that NVIDIA cannot do inference. And so I think that's why the stock is down this much. And I think it's important for people who care about AI, but also may traffic in NVIDIA to understand why the sharps think that. And I think several of us have tried to explain it now for the last couple of weeks, but it is miscast. And so you're overspending.